It is my pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker. Andrew Cassilly currently serves as Senior Advisor to the Office of the Governor. Andrew's role includes advising the governor on legislative and policy issues and serving as a liaison to the Maryland General Assembly members. Andrew works closely with several departments, including MDOT, MEA, DNR, MDA, and others to address legislative issues and recommendations. Prior to his role serving the governor, Andrew served 5 years as a state delegate for Harford County, serving on the Environment and Transportation Committee. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in Industrial Technology from Millersville University in Pennsylvania, and his master's degree in Administrative Management from Loyola College in Baltimore. So please welcome me in joining Andrew to the stage. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. When Scott called me and said, hey, will you come talk to this group about legislation? I said, sure, it would be fun. But then I was sitting back there listening, and I thought, so really what we're doing is we're taking a large group of people used to being outside in the environment. We're going to put them in a room with no windows for 3 days, and I get to talk to them last. Like, what could be better? This is perfect. And I get to talk to them about legislation, which is completely stimulating. But what I guess the good news here is you've been listening to university level discussions and information. I'm going to take it all the way down to high school, so it will relieve your stress. I'll apologize for that. And right off the bat, I spent many years teaching teenagers, so that's basically where my level of cognitive ability is. So hopefully it will be somewhat enjoyable. So let's get started. We're talking about really the whole legislative process. And I was thinking as I was putting this together yesterday, really before we actually say, okay, let's talk about legislation, the first thing we need to decide is, do we even want legislation? Do we want to legislate, or do we just want to regulate? Departments, the Department of the Environment, the Department of Natural Resources, they have regulations they put in place, and they can update them as needed. But you can also legislate regulations if you choose to do so, and I'll give you some examples of different pieces of legislation and why that may be useful. What are the advantages of it? If you legislate, it's more permanent. The only way you can change regulations that have been legislatively mandated is you have to put in another bill. So it's kind of locked in there. And I guess, and I apologize, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but can you, just so I know who I'm talking to, if you're from Maryland, raise your hand. Okay, the bunch of you. How about if you're from the United States? How about if you're outside the United States? I heard somebody had a really cool accent, and I was jealous. That made me sound more intelligent. So in Maryland, because I'm talking about the world according to me, I'm talking about the Maryland General Assembly. And what you need to understand is the General Assembly in Maryland is what we call part-time General Assembly, which means that we go down to Annapolis for 90 days. We have an active legislative session, and at the end of those 90 days, people, what I call, go back to real jobs. And the nice thing about that is when you're down in Annapolis, you're down there with doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, police officers, electricians. People come from all walks of life. They put their private hat on hold, and they come down and they serve as a legislator for that 90 days. And I think that's incredible, valuable to Maryland, because I think it always gives you somewhat of a content expert in the room when you're talking about different pieces of legislation. But because we're part-time, because we're only there during the 90 days, it gives us a lot of time during the interim when we're outside to really talk about legislation, what's good, what's bad, what should we be legislating and what shouldn't we be legislating. Another advantage to legislation is to inform and educate. And I tell people this all the time, like sometimes people say, well, why would you put a bill on that? Sometimes it's just to let people understand. For example, in Maryland, how much distance do you have to give to a cyclist if you're passing them in your car? Say it. 3 feet. 3 feet. So it's basically from the center of your chest to the end of your 3 feet. Well, I think it's 3 feet from the vehicle to the side. How many people do you ever think have gotten pulled over for this? There have been some. It certainly isn't a whole number of people. So you might say, well, then that bill's completely useless. Well, no, because a large part of that bill actually was used to educate. When that bill came out, everybody was talking about it, signs went up, there was commercials about it. So the legislation itself actually served as an educational tool to make people aware of what was going on. So sometimes legislation, even though you're not probably going to actually implement the legislation as far as like fining somebody or holding them accountable, just the education piece, it's worth it to put it in. Direct departments into action, and I'll talk about it. I had a wastewater treatment bill that I put in many years ago. Sometimes the departments aren't the most proactive, and they'll sit on regulations that become antiquated, and legislation can kind of spur them into updating their regulations. Impose consequences for offensive behavior. Obviously, that's the easiest way. Like, for example, what is the fine for littering? Can be up to $300 if somebody sees you throw your trash on the ground. It could be depends if you're in your vehicle or if you're just kind of walking down the road. Probably not enforced a whole lot. What's more likely to happen would be illegal dumping, and that's when somebody sees you, and that's like $10,000. But that's to impose some sort of consequences for poor behavior, and that's probably the most common. And then to incentivize a practice. So you guys just saw a film that had most of the programs that you saw that were in that film, whether they were agriculture or something like that, they're all geared around legislation that put those programs in place to incentivize that. So if you're going to move forward with incentivizing, how are you going, well, like what are the incentives going to be? So the first one, obviously, the easiest one is like a tax rebate. If you put your property in land preservation or something like that, you can get rebates on your property taxes. A form of payment. I think they mentioned in the CREP program, which is an agricultural program. If you put your property in forest conservation, they'll actually pay you. You get payments of it's like $100 a month per acre or something like that to keep your land in forest conservation. And then obviously the last one, the easiest, is it's a legislative mandate. You're basically just saying we're moving forward with this law because we think it's the right thing to do, and it's going to, it may cost you some money to implement it, but it's the law. How many of you guys know William McDonough? William McDonough is an author. He's written several books. He basically was kind of, in my opinion, he was like the forefather guy to sustainability. He was using that term 15, 20 years ago. And I can remember at one point in the school system, I went into my superintendent and I said, I want to be the sustainability manager. And he looked at me like I said I wanted to be the grand poobah. He was like, what the hell is that? But it's now become more popular, and obviously a whole industry is geared out over this. But he came up with, at the time, a lot of concepts that people were like, wow, that's revolutionary. Like the whole concept is, there's no such thing as throwing something away because away is going away. There's no one that says, oh, you can put it over here. So we have to really rethink the way that we're dealing with waste. Well, the reason I bring him up is because as a legislator, I used his triple bottom line concept every time I was putting legislation together. Every time I was about to tackle an issue legislatively, I would look at, okay, how does it fit into the triple bottom line, or what some people would call, when I talk to high school kids, we call it the 3P: people, planet, and profit. So if you're putting in a piece of legislation that only addresses one of those, if you say we're going to make diesel school buses illegal, that's great for the environment sector, but from the social standpoint, people probably wouldn't be very happy if their kids had to walk to school. So you have to look at, okay, how's this going to impact us on the social side? And really in the center where it meets, where it's bearable, that's the best part. If you have a bill that will hit one of those areas, probably not going to pass. If you can make two of those areas, you got a better chance. And if you can get three areas, you got a really, really good chance of getting that bill to pass the General Assembly. So let's talk about moving the bill through the General Assembly. Once you've drafted your bill, you put it together, you said, I have this great idea, I've checked all the boxes, I make sure that it meets all those categories. If you're going to put it forward to the General Assembly, you need to do a little bit of homework. And the first thing you want to consider is, what committee is this legislation going to go through? There's several committees down in Annapolis, and it's not always obvious which one it's going to go through. Using the school bus theme, if I said I'm going to legislatively require that municipalities and school systems purchase electric school buses. Or you might think, well, it's school bus, so therefore it's transportation. It's going to go through environment and transportation. It just makes common sense. But the president of the Senate could say, you know what? I think it's procurement, so I'm going to send it in a different direction. That's important because depending on where you send your I think maybe I left my second phone in a bag over there. So if you're wondering why the hell isn't that guy turning off his phone, it's probably because it's me and my other phone's up here. So we can either ignore it or you can throw the bag outside in the hallway. I apologize. I'm thinking, that sounds like my other ringer. Sorry about that. So yeah, because the leaders down there can pick what committee it's going to go through, that makes a big difference. And I've seen where sometimes if a piece of legislation is hitting a roadblock going through a particular committee, the speakers will actually send it in a different direction, which can be very dangerous because then bills can pass largely because the people that are reviewing it don't have the background or the content knowledge. And so it's really important that you're looking at, okay, how is, which committee is this going to go through? And then you have to find which is the right legislator to carry that ball, to carry that bill. I often look at legislation, if you've ever seen the nature videos of sea turtles hatching, and it's really cool, it's so pretty. They all come out of the sand, and there's literally hundreds of them, and they're all running towards the beach, and all of a sudden you see the predators, and they come swooping in. There's snakes, there's seagulls, there's all kinds of creatures going at them. And I started thinking, the legislative process is like that too, because I could have a cute little bill. It's perfect. I love it. And it's running on its way into the ocean, and something will just come out of nowhere and just knock it out. We'll kill the bill. Sometimes perfectly good bills, matter of fact, a lot of times, perfectly good bills will not survive the legislative process for a variety of dysfunctional reasons. That doesn't mean you get discouraged. That means you go back, you clean it up, you change it up. And it's not uncommon that sometimes legislation will take 2, 3, even 4 years to make it through the General Assembly. And sometimes that can just be because it's so complicated that people just don't understand it. And so it's like, when in doubt, vote no. That way I can't be responsible. So you have to come back the next year and the next year. And each year they get a little bit more familiar with it. And so there's, like I said, there's a variety of that. But certain legislators are known for certain strengths. So there are legislators in Annapolis that are known for, because they're in law enforcement. If you were putting in a bill on law enforcement, it would make sense to go through that individual because it's not their title, but people recognize, oh, Harry, he always does energy bills, or Shannon, she's always doing environmental bills. Find out who those champions are and try to network to have them sponsor the bill. I've had perfectly good bills that I knew if I put them in, they'd be dead. But I was able to put them in through another sponsor, and I actually have done that several times. And in that case, we all win. I win because I get the bill that I wanted passed. The sponsor gets to say I passed the bill, and it's kind of like a win-win situation. The next piece is the last piece, kind of in this process, is lobbying your stakeholders. And what I mean by that is, you can't just go to the committee, you also have to go to the General Assembly at large. Now, depending on the legislation, would be kind of depend on how you lobbied. So for example, I've seen legislation go through that had no professional lobbyists involved. They just had a really good influx of dedicated citizens that came down and just flooded Annapolis. For example, like if you were putting a bill in on increasing the length of time that breathalyzers have to be in a vehicle if you're found guilty of drunk driving, and the Mothers Against Drunk Driving came down, they're a very powerful force. And they'll come down in the hundreds, and they will flood and hit every office. If you got a bill like that, you really don't need a professional lobbyist. If you have a bill that's more on the complicated end, or it's a little bit more obscure, professional lobbyists can be a real advantage. The advantage to using someone who lives down in Annapolis, who basically is ingrained, knows all the personalities, knows the back doors. They also know how the system works because there's unwritten rules, if you will, that they kind of learn over time, and they can be very valuable in helping the legislation go through. And it just depends on the legislation and whether or not you would need to go that route, but it's something to consider. So kind of what I like to do, and I put, because I wasn't sure, I hate to lecture, I'd feel much more comfortable if you're asking questions. So these are examples of legislation, but before we go into them, I'd like to kind of pause if we could and kind of check your understanding of what I've said so far. Do you have questions, comments, concerns? Happy to discuss it. I feel much happier if I could walk, but I'm going to hold on to this thing and stand right here and take any questions that you may have. And if not, I'm just going to keep right on talking about legislation.
I have a question about some of the more recommended ways to start inquiring into who are the best people to talk to find the champion within the legislation. I mean, you have some impact on, or your federal senators, your representatives, you know them pretty well, you go to their websites, but your state representatives is a little more complicated to find.
That's a great question.
Who's doing that.
Sure, that's a great question. So you can go to the Maryland General Assembly website. The first thing you'd want to do is talk to your delegation. Every district has a delegation of legislators. Most of them would not be offended in the least if you came up to them and said, hey, I have a agricultural bill. Who's the best person to carry this bill? Generally, they want the bill to pass too for you. So either they're going to say you should go with, Senator Smith, or, recommend you a different path. But I would always suggest you start with your own delegation. But at the same time, it's not too hard to get that type of information, just like calling lobbyists, calling down there and say, which lobbying firm deals with environmental legislation the most? And when you get to them, say, which senator do you work with the most? And you can kind of do a little bit of investigation to find that. That's a great question. So while he's sprinting across the other side of the room, I'll grab, for an example, we were talking about pushing departments into action. Several years ago, I was giving a tour to a group of high school kids through a wastewater treatment plant, and it was state of the art. When you walked in, it looked like NASA, bells and whistles. It was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And in my conversations with the engineer, I said, so really, this is the next generation. I mean, this is what everyone's going to be building. And he said, not necessarily, because really, this system is twice as expensive as the old system, and we still have to put in the same size drain field, even though the effluent coming out of the plant is clean enough that you could actually drink it. We still have to put in a gigantic drain field. And I said, well, why don't you just change that? And he said, I don't know how to do that. But I put in a bill, and we were actually successful at saying if you use the new technology, you can have a smaller drain field to incentivize people to say, well, it's a break even probably endeavor, but I get a much cleaner and better running facility. Question?
Not really a question, more like a comment. Vaughn Stewart has expressed interest in a beaver bill, so on the House side, that's a good place to the previous question as to which legislators are interested in these topics.
So if Vaughn was here, he would appreciate me saying he's a crazy whack, because I'm a Republican, and I'll apologize to that right up front. I say that Vaughn's a great guy.
Absolutely.
Vaughn's a great guy, and he's in environment and transportation. Depending on the legislation, certain people, even within that committee, for example, and I'll throw another, David Fraser Holdago, he is the chair of the transportation subcommittee. Anyone in there can put in transportation legislation and have a fairly good shot, but who better to have than the chair of the subcommittee put it in? So you got your plug for Vaughn. Tell him you did your job. Yeah. I'm just teasing you. He's a great guy. Any other questions? Gosh, it got really cold when I said I was a Republican. I'm recovering now. I'm a recovering Republican. You want me to keep going? Okay, good. Because I don't want to keep talking about stuff that you're not interested in.
So, thanks, Andrew. Good. This is great. I'm often wondering, you got an idea, right? There's a problem we want to solve. We make the world a better place, whatever. And we work on a daily basis with folks in these departments, that are on the ground, right? Talk about, do you give folks a heads up, or do you go right to the legislator, working with government staff? How does that? Is there sort of a wall there where they can't help you, or we don't want to, in trying to do legislation, sort of alienate those that are still sort of learning with us and
so I'm going to translate that. We have to be very frank so that we understand what we're saying. Are you saying you would be hesitant to put in state legislation for fear of offending local county offices? Or state? Okay. Don't ever be afraid of that. And the reason I tell you that is generally the departments, DNR, and they don't take legislation personally. Many times they look at it as an opportunity to get things done that they wanted to get done anyway. And so if you put in a legislation and it's not quite right, what would happen is that department, DNR, MDE, would come and say, Scott, I love your bill. You're a little bit off. What would you think about it if we tweaked it so it did this, this, or this? And there's a lot of that. Bills will survive several, sometimes multiple amendments to where everybody weighs in and says, I could live with this, but I'd like this way. And generally, if you're flexible, a lot of times you can get something out. It's rare that you get everything, but it's somewhere in the middle where you can minimize or reduce the opposition, to where a lot of times the opposition might look at you and say, you know what, we know this is coming anyway. So let's just grab onto this one. And would you be willing to step back to this, this, and this? And so it's a great question. You should never be afraid to put in legislation. Again, sometimes you have to prompt people. You have to push people along, and sometimes they might not even realize that there's an issue. And it's a great way to as I said, I often look at legislation as a form to educate people into, hey, this is an issue. And sometimes I've seen bills go through, they didn't pass, and the person's impressed. I said, you just realize many of them had never heard of this before. When you first told me, hey, this was many years ago, I was with Scott. We were looking at some of his environmental projects. I was trying to figure out a way where we could develop trails so that kids could go to those, kind of walk through the engineered wetlands and actually use their phone, where there'd be QR things where they could pull it up and link and get little lessons on vernal pools and things like that. And he started talking to me about using beavers, and I was looking at him. I was like, okay, Scott. And I thought, he's a nut. So a lot of times it's just sheer ignorance. They just don't even realize that there's something new out there. That's kind of like the last one, because I'm getting the sign. Anaerobic digesters. I put legislation in several years ago on anaerobic digesters. I can remember people looking at me like, what the heck are you talking about? It took 3 years with 3 separate bills. The first bill was simply just to define organic waste, because the law is very specific. So we had to actually define what is organic waste before we could attempt to actually start dealing with it. So again, sometimes it can get pretty technical in the process. So if there's no more questions, if there's a question. I only threw that in there because I was talking to a guy yesterday who was trying to convince me that we need to legislatively require that we move to electric tractor trailers. And I asked him for his rationale, and he said, well, because diesel engines last for 30 years. And if we sell them now, they're going to be out there for 30 years. And I said, well, I have a kerosene heater in my wood shop, and I haven't used it in years, not because it's broken, it's because I can't find kerosene. And so sometimes it's just our perception of how fast things move. Yes?
I was wondering if you could give us tips about approaching legislators that you want to build a relationship with and maybe raise their awareness about, in this case, beavers. And every legislator has a staff whose job's to filter, and I was also curious how thick is that filter? How often do things that we would send to the office staff actually get through?
That's a great question. Just to kind of rephrase that, legislators sometimes have a chief of staff. They have several small, depending on how high they are in the feeding frenzy, but. It's a great idea to work with the staff, and this is where lobbyists come in handy, because oftentimes the lobbyists will work directly with the staff, because the staff is the one that talks to the legislator all of the time. A great way to educate them is to invite them to actually see things. For example, I set up a trip for Environment and Transportation Committee to come out and get a briefing on the Conowingo Dam. This was like 4 years ago. They met at the Environmental Center up the hill, and just so that they could learn about what's this do? Why do we need it? Why can't we just rip it down? But having them come there. So inviting them to opportunities. And sometimes that means bringing the show on the road. There are briefings every year in every single committee. And so Environment and Transportation will have pre-season briefings at the beginning, usually for a couple days. You can reach out to the staff for that committee and say, hey, in your briefing, whatever, could we get 15 minutes, do a 15-minute presentation or briefing on environmental remediation using beavers? I was trying to think of a more technical term, but couldn't come up with it. Did that answer your question? Okay. So remember I said Scott was enough. I was watching this video, and it really, to me, this is where you guys are. Some of you have seen this before, but maybe look at it in a different light. No one knows about what you're doing, okay? I mean, bird watchers are here. You guys are like somewhere down here. This is a great kept secret. So you really are, all of you are the first followers. And I thought it was apropos. I thought this was very apropos.
Leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is overglorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
So thank you very much for allowing me to come before you. To me, it's super exciting. It's like a really cool secret. I am going to meet with Scott afterwards because I do want to help you work on ideas for legislation, if nothing more than to inform and educate, because that's going to be an uphill battle. This will be a major lift, but I think it's a super, super worthy endeavor. And again, thanks for having me today.